The majority of immigrants in the recent past at the Mexican-US border have come from three countries: Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, known as the Northern Triangle countries. They are the largest source of asylum seekers to the US. By the end of October 2019, almost 1 million were arrested at the southern border in the first 10 months of 2019, the majority being families and children. By the end of March 2021, 172,000 had arrived at the border in that month, and 20,000 unaccompanied children have been placed in facilities, including 2 Texas military bases. Before addressing the climate crisis as a growing factor driving Central Americans to the US-Mexico border, I will give a brief backdrop of violence, corruption, and poverty in these countries, and the role of US military and corporate capitalism, factors that are also at the root of the migration to our southern border. In 1954, President Eisenhower ordered the overthrow of democratically elected President Arbenz, who had issued the Agrarian Reform Law, which redistributed land to landless indigenous peasants. Why the overthrow? To protect United Fruit's, now Chiquita Banana International, land interests. Throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s Cold War era, the US backed government overthrows and aided right-wing leaders with troops and weapons to repress left-leaning social movements, resulting in the death of hundreds of thousands of Guatemalans. One president we championed, Efrain Rios Montt, was convicted of genocide in 2013 for trying to eliminate Mayan peasants. Former President Morales, accused of corruption and sexual abuse of women, signed a so-called Safe Third Country Agreement in Trump's office in 2019, which would send Honduran and El Salvadoran migrants who had passed through Guatemala en route to the US border back to Guatemala. In turn, Guatemala received aid and training from the Department of Homeland Security to militarize its borders. The current president is a right-wing former prison director. Safe Third Country, so-called Safe Third Country agreements with El Salvador and Honduras were also signed under Trump. They are a travesty, given the purpose of the agreements is to assure that refugees at our southern border are sent to a country that can provide security, freedom from persecution, and healthful conditions. None of these countries, riddled with corruption, gangs, poverty, and extreme crime rates, can do that. In 1960, President Eisenhower, fearing a leftist government, facilitated a right-wing coup. The same Cold War ideology drove President Reagan to provide generous military assistance and training in 1983 to the repressive military-led government in its civil war against a leftist front. 80,000 Salvadorans were killed in the 1980 to 1992 civil war, with the majority of civilian deaths caused by Salvadoran military and death squads. And of course, this is what our aid was supporting. El Salvador's current president, Nayib Bukele, is giving the US Embassy a large role in government policies. He has fired public sector workers and supports privatizing water and canceling a ban on new metal mines. He blames the poor for their poverty in the spirit of neoliberal capitalism. He has authoritarian, misogynist, populist appeal and has been compared to Trump. In 2009, reform-minded President Manuel Zelaya, who had raised minimum wage, built new schools, instituted school lunch programs, provided pensions for the elderly, and was on the verge of signing land over to 300,000 small farmers to expand the working class base, was kidnapped by the Honduran military and flown out of the country to Costa Rica. The general who led the coup was trained by the U.S. Army at its then named School of the Americas, popularly known as the School of the Assassins, for the generous number of Latin American graduates who instigated coups and tortured and murdered political opponents. The Obama administration tacitly supported the coup and had an assisting role in preventing Zelaya's return to Honduras. The US government has continued to approve subsequent illegally elected presidents and provide aid for militarized security there. Since the coup, over the past 12 years, police, military, and hired militias have tortured, raped, and murdered thousands of indigenous activists, peasant leaders, journalists, human rights and union activists, opposition candidates, and judges. The government has also censored any critical media. In 2016, Honduras had the highest murder rate and rape rate in the world. I recommend for those interested, The Long Honduran Night, a book by Dana Frank, which has a detailed history of this period. Drug traffickers infiltrate the Honduran government of Juan Orlando Hernandez from top to bottom, including the police and military. Berta Cáceres, a prominent environmental justice activist of whom I know you know and respected, as did I, was working against logging and dam building by corporations on indigenous lands. She was murdered, of course, we know this, in 2016. The murderers included Honduran military trained in the US and hired by the Honduran dam building company DESA. In that same year, the US Berta Cáceres Human Rights in Honduras Act was introduced into our Congress, calling to suspend military and financial assistance to police and military in Honduras until human rights violations by the police and military cease and the perpetrators are brought to justice. This bill was reintroduced in March 2021 with 40 co-sponsors in Congress. I will add that the Honduran immigration to the US southern border began in high numbers after the 2009 coup in Honduras. US Border Patrol separated thousands of Central American children from their families seeking asylum since 2017, and as you are familiar with, imprisoned them in cold, crowded detention centers with filthy toilets and insufficient running water. Many of these children have lingered, lost in the detention system, as the government did not document their parents' names or whereabouts. In 2019, 70,000 children at the border were put into detention facilities. A key priority of the Biden administration is to reunite children still remaining in those detention systems with their families, here or in their countries. Lawyers for the children have requested that families be allowed to migrate here. Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, located in the Central American Dry Corridor, are some of the most vulnerable countries to climate change in the entire world, exposed to worsening hurricanes, hotspot temperature increases, sea level rise, and drought exacerbated by El Niño and deforestation. All three countries declared a food emergency in 2017. In the same year, a World Food Program study found that nearly 1/2 of those who left these Central American countries did so due to lack of food. Under Trump, the US funded border control, police, and military in these three countries and cut humanitarian aid to punish the Northern Triangle countries for migration and to force them to militarize their borders to entrap migrants. The situation is mixed under Biden, and we will discuss that later. Indigenous and small rural farmers are most hurt by the climate crisis. The loss of crops for a period of 2 years in a row causes insecurity and starvation, forcing migration to cities. Violence, the highest rates of murder and rape being in cities, is also then driving them out of the cities and north to Mexico and the United States. El Salvador is projected to lose 10 to 28% of its coastline by the end of the century. Rising sea level is destroying mangrove forests, marine life in them, and the livelihood of fishermen and their families. El Salvador is the most water-stressed country in Central America. One study found that El Salvador would run out of water in 80 years. The factors include lost rainwater due to deforestation and hardened soil. That is, with deforestation, the water runs off and less water is stored in the soil, and it becomes compacted as well from the water runoff. Huge amounts of drinking water are also lost through leaks in the water pipe distribution system, and this would generally be in cities. The aquifer capacity for the capital city can be reduced anywhere from 20% to 48%. But the biggest industrial users and polluters, and among them are the Coca-Cola Company, sugarcane plantations, as well as new and large upscale housing developments and malls in the capital city, San Salvador, are not subjected to the city's water rationing. This is the power of the wealthy and the government. At least 90% of the country's surface water, so rivers, ponds, lakes, is contaminated from untreated sewage and agricultural and industrial waste. Obviously not required to treat their waste. Water scarcity in gang territory causes risks to local residents, like the one in the photo, from gang violence and extortion of sex and money for water. According to the UN, women are the greatest victims of corruption in the world through what is called sextortion. Guatemala has the 6th highest malnutrition rate in the world. 1 in 10 suffered hunger due to drought-related crop failures in 2018. The country has lost 1/2 of its forests in the last 40 years. Consequently, it suffers as a result of deforestation, floods, landslides, and soil erosion. 80% of the coffee crop has been wiped out by coffee leaf rust in some regions. Consequently, low-wage workers lose their jobs. Extreme inequality plagues all 3 countries. And an example in Guatemala is 2% own 70% of the cropland. 30% in the 3 countries work in agriculture. 30% of jobs are in agriculture. Coffee, one of the most important cash and subsistence crops in the region, tolerates only a small thermal range. So much is being lost to coffee leaf rust due to climate warming, as the rust thrives in hot weather. The country suffered 4 years of drought from 2014 to 2018. In that same period, temperatures rose by nearly 2 degrees Fahrenheit, wreaking havoc on the growing season and creating a breeding ground for coffee rust. Honduras is losing its Pacific West Coast tourist area to sea level rise at the rate of about 1 meter per year. That's immense. It is also losing coastal mangrove forests that support local fishing and protect the coast. And corporate shrimp farming has moved in, and which offers few jobs. Drug traffickers are seeking new smuggling routes to avoid capture. They are destroying tropical forests for new roads and landing strips to transport drugs to the ever-growing US market. This causes loss of forests in Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Colombia, and recently Costa Rica, so virtually all of Central America and Colombia. Local people, including many indigenous peoples, are threatened and forced off of their lands due to this drug money at work. And why this development? The US war on drugs, as you know, is heavily militarized, and it is forcing drug traffickers to seek more and more clandestine routes. So for the next few slides, we will look at what policy recommendations have been made for these various issues that I have just gone through with respect to the effect of the climate crisis, but also lack of water treatment in El Salvador. These are some policy solutions. One policy solution proposed is to give local communities more control over forests. And this is the forests that are being essentially removed by drug traffickers to develop their drug trafficking routes. One is to grant indigenous land rights and recognize and enforce these land rights across the countries at risk. Studies have found that where this has happened, there is less loss of forests because local people with land rights have become what are called forest guardians. This has been studied and found to deter somewhat the work of drug traffickers to deforest and remove people from their land. However, it seems like a very dangerous intervention. This is an ecological solution. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization recommendations for food resilience programs in Central America's dry corridor include agroforestry, also short cycle and drought resistant crops such as sorghum, water harvesting systems, and the planting of grasses, bushes, and trees, as you see in this photo, to hold soil and soil moisture on deforested land. However, this UN agency, while assisting these dry corridor countries, has a funding shortfall. One policy recommendation offered by a recent study, and this recent study included John Kerry, that's before he's in his current position as what they call climate czar, is that US aid, and we do give aid to these countries. Part of it is military for the police and military, and part is for economic development. But that this US aid should target microeconomic growth and sustainable agriculture in vulnerable areas and with vulnerable populations. That's where the need is, rather than continuing US investment in large extractive corporations, ours, that are located there. In this slide, we begin to see solutions for solving the critical water shortage. 4 recommendations have been offered. First of all, the national or federal government needs to declare water a human right. I'm not sure it's been declared here, but declare a human right. Second, to establish a strong national government system for water. Currently, the provision of water supply is split among many agencies and also 2,000 locally run networks. So it needs to be centralized and invested in. Third, repair leaks in distribution pipes. This would be especially in urban areas. And regulate the treatment of sewage and industrial waste before it is discharged into local water bodies and groundwater. This repair of leaks suggestion, that was what solved Boston's problem of not enough water. This was in the 70s when they wanted to divert water from the Connecticut River east to Boston. And instead, after a lot of pressure, resistance here and pressure, they set about repairing the leaks and developing more efficient systems and use of water, and consequently solve the problem without having to divert water from the Connecticut River. And fourth, set up rainwater collection, barrels, cisterns holding ponds, and that's especially good for rural areas, and undertake reforestation for water retention in soil and groundwater. And that would be much more suitable, of course, for rural farming and agriculture. The 100-day moratorium on deportations was put on hold due to a Texas federal court order. And so this was one of the first acts of the Biden administration, was a moratorium on deportations. However, that was put on hold, and consequently, ICE is still deporting people at the Texas border and pushing people, because they are deporting them, pushing people to migrate in farther away in borderlands, and left in some cases to die in the desert. And often ICE, it's been found, are not responding to 911 calls. The Muslim ban was canceled. There's been no challenges to that, so that's in effect. While work on the border wall has been halted, a virtual high-tech wall accomplishes the same, and that is supported by Biden. It may extend as far as 100 miles inland. A high-tech wall is capable of collecting biometric data, such as facial recognition. It includes aerial drones, infrared cameras, motion sensors, and radar. It is seen by immigrant activists as a technocentric effective means of border control. It is being built in part, that is here, by major weapons companies, Raytheon, L3Harris, Lockheed Martin, who gave more money to Biden during his campaign than to Trump in 2020. I will just say that these high-tech virtual border walls have been perfected by Israel in the West Bank and Gaza. It's big business throughout the world, anticipating greater conflict and migration due to climate crisis and conflict. Another action taken by the Biden administration, reuniting separated families, is underway. I think it still may be in the planning stage, but it's definitely underway and not contested. The bill for pathway to citizenship for 11 million immigrants, which he has proposed, includes undocumented migrants in our country. It reinstates DACA. However, given the political climate in Congress, advocates fear it will be very difficult to pass. Biden proposed a plan for 125,000 refugees to be allowed into the United States in 2021. That has been revised downward to about 62,000, actually 500, in one half. The plan of study to review and revamp asylum seekers forced to stay in Mexico, and that was the Remain in Mexico policy from the Trump administration, is underway. It's in the study and planning stages at this point. The study of how to stem the flow of migration by helping combat corruption in Northern Triangle countries is underway. That is a policy that Biden has proposed, which is how to stem. We need to know how to stem the flow of the migration over time. The concern is that our aid to these countries has the goal of, one, supporting current economic development model of corporate capitalism. So this does not help the migrants coming to our border. Two, sustaining, this is our funds, our aid to these countries, will sustain the militarized security systems in place. And they're in place thanks to earlier US military aid. But we will continue to support military police in order to keep in or return migrants to their countries. Biden has canceled Trump's third country agreements, but he supports the countries of Mexico. I'm saying he, it did not originate with him, but he supports the countries of Mexico and Guatemala to return migrants crossing their borders into their home countries. Some critics have pointed out that Mexico's and Guatemala's militarized security borders, which were funded by the US, now function as the US southern border to deter migrants. And I'll just point out that you're familiar with this, the inconsistencies in US immigration policy. The wealthy and educated are welcomed, but the poor have been excluded and discouraged. An open door policy for the politically correct, such as Cubans and Colombians, is part of our immigration policy. And the ease of border crossings for corporations and corporate products through trade agreements over people, NAFTA and CAFTA, that's a Central American Free Trade Agreement. And they enjoy the freedom of capital over the freedom of human beings crossing our borders. So on the final slide, I've listed a handful of themes for discussion and welcome your thoughts and questions as well. Thank you for your presence, for your dedication, your commitment, and I look forward to our discussion.